Okay, so in this video, let's look at how to beat McDonald and Grand Prix if you are a Sicilian player. This idea, this f4 or knight c3 with f4 that comes anyway, this is the very reason why I stopped being a Sicilian player. So let's look at this move. So f4 is met with d5, that's what you want to play. And they usually either play e5 here or they take the pawn. But let's look a little bit of everything. If, let's say, they play knight c3, here, knight c3 is a little bit premature because you can attack it right away with d4. And when the knight moves, knight to c6, and we got, you know, now they have to play d3, but this is obviously, you can tell that the white player is not being very white right now and is allowing black for too much development. This is, you know, it's not supposed to be like that. It's like, why would you be the first player that moves so you can get into the most passive position? e5, black strikes the center, takes control of the center. Knight f3, and then obviously a move like f5 here is stupid. You just play g6, and obviously g4 cannot really go and support the pawn. You're leaving this diagonal open and you're in big trouble. Besides, you also, you know, you take, and this is much better for black. So let's not look at that. Knight f3, developing, take, knight g2, e7, develop, knight g3, h5, bishop develops, h4. The knight has to move, knight to f5, take it with the bishop, crazy enough, because when they take you back, you're going to play knight in d5, excellent square, targeting the bishop is trapped, can't really move anywhere here, that makes sense. f6 is also coming, if the bishop goes back to d2, for example, bishop to d6, obviously you don't want to give the knight for this bishop, the bishop would be very happy to give the knight in e3, castle, queen e7, and now a move like bishop g5 as mentioned, you play f6, that bishop cannot play anymore for the rest of the game, can't really take that because knight e3, right? Let's look at something else, slightly different. After queen to e7, what if rook to e1, castle, bishop to f1, attacking the queen, queen to c7. c3, targeting this center, is a very strong center, and also the white players will be very interested in playing rook to c1, king to b8, and when they take back. So obviously we're attacking the pawn, so h3 is, it doesn't work because you can just win the pawn for free. Instead of that, what if our opponent takes our knight? Well, h3 now hasn't been played, but before recapturing, we have to take this move, which is why white tried h3 before, right? But then lost the pawn in f5, so that doesn't make sense. So this check was going to happen anyway. King h1, now we recapture the knight. We don't care about rook c1 because queen to g3. It's weird because it doesn't look like we have a mate in such position because this bishop shouldn't be there. It's quite the liability. Queen to f3, swapping with our tremendous queen, h3. And we don't care. Queen check, pawn takes back. And now, obviously, the rook moves from the attack of the bishop. Take, bishop retreats. King to f2, rook to h5. And we're building on this weak pawn, and black is better. Black position is -3. So we're gonna abandon this temporarily. Let's go back a second. So after d5, we went to knight c3. It was too premature. Let's go through e5, which is the main move, the move I hated the most. Knight c6, and now they build this strong center. What about the knight in c3 now? Does that work? Okay, let's look at this. Bishop f5, develop this bishop because you want to play e6, but you don't want to lock your bishop in. Bishop b5, rook to c8. What to do now? If they take you take back with the rook. Knight to b5. If they play that move, you just attack the knight. This move doesn't do much. The knight moves, and now d4 can happen. Knight c to e2, and now d3 can happen. I understand the patterns. Never memorize the moves. Look at this position. Take e6. We don't even care about recapturing that. Knight f3, take. Castle, and now c4. And the position is considerably better for black. I mean, the game is not over at all. This position is like -2. But how is this bishop going to play? If he ever does this move to play, then check. King moves. And now knight to h6, threatening the usual knight g4, knight to f2. What about h3? Well, then you do knight f5. And the position is -3. It looks like our opponent can develop our pieces, except the fact that we can take this one, and then there's a fork that wins the game. What to do now? What can well, knight to c3, I don't know, then you lose the, you know, you lose the exchange, but there's also knight g3, so everything is like, it's like a minefield. So let's go back a second. After rook c8, The variation with bishop takes, rook takes, there's no much need to do that. Also because we're threatening d4. Let's go here, knight f3. This is the obvious move. h5. Castle, e6, d4. What about d4? This is the normal move. Knight to h6. It's important to play h5 before knight h6. This supports the knight in g4. And also, you do want to play h4, h3 at some point. I've seen it a lot. Bishop e3, knight g4. Queen defends the bishop. Take, take. Attack the bishop. If the bishop retreats, you're going to trap it. So it's forced to take you. Take. And now queen to d2. Obviously, because you're threatening to take, and then, you know, the bishop in c5, pinning these guys, it's a nightmare. So queen d2, bishop e7, knight e2, with the idea of maybe placing e3, h4, c3, c4. And our opponent has no mobility. Not much. Not much, actually, if you think about it. b3, trying to dismantle our strong wall of pawns. a5, strangely enough, because it can take, but you can take back with the rook. And why did we do this move? So that we can put pressure on the most backwards pawn. Queen b2, queen c7, rook c1. Looks like that pawn is now defended. Rook to a4. And I was threatening this. And also the knight was still defending that pawn, but remember you can pin this knight. Position evaluated -2. Let's go here. After we played knight to g4, attacking the bishop. Earlier we went through queen e2. What about the bishop retreating to d2? Well, that doesn't work because you can take this pawn. Take queen to b6, attacking the knight. Knight defends it, bishop c5, increase the pressure. Take, removing one of the attackers to that knight. And now we still have got 2 attackers. But a move like c3 doesn't work because of bishop d3. And we're gonna, you know, we're attacking that knight, and then we're gonna be taking this pawn. When the knight moves, it's a free pawn. The knight is going to f2, game over. If instead this gets defended with the bishop, knight to e3 is possible, making a fork. So it's a minefield of problems for the white player. I wish I had known all of this stuff when I used to play Sicilian until I just gave up. I was too tired of the Anti-Sicilians. The one I hate the most is e4, c5, and then b4. I just resigned straight away. No reason in playing that game. Anyway, what move have we not seen? So after e5, knight c6, knight f3, this is the main move. So let's go. Knight h6. And now a bunch of options. What to see first? I don't know. Bishop e2. Let's look at this. It's one of the most boring. But what the moves I have is bishop e5 is one of them. And the other one is d4. D4 is stupid. It's quick mention. Bishop g4, and you're already conquering d4, and you know this. Our opponent shouldn't want to do that because now they're forced to take this pawn, but then you're gonna recapture the whole French close center is gone. Knight b to d2 doesn't work because you play knight f5, and it's just fantastic, right? -1 already as of the opening, and this is you know, if they attack you. You can play knight e3, the queen is forced to move, and you can go in c2, although the most cynical move is knight takes in d4 with an attack on the queen. And yeah, so this is a great position. So let's now go through this. After knight to h6, the 2 moves you're going to look at the bishop moves so that white can castle. Let's start with bishop e2. Or actually, let's actually go through bishop b5 first. I can't be bothered. So knight, bishop to b5. I used to encounter this. I hated it because the white player knows that there's a specific weakness in d4. That also often happens when you play f4. d4 becomes more left out. Bishop to d7 protects it. What is going to happen now? If white castles, stupid move because knight e5. You win a pawn for free. No compensation. The bishop is going to be taking the bishop. If the bishop takes you, you take back with the knight and you won a pawn. d4 doesn't matter. Take back. e6, you're safe. You're also threatening this move, which we can assume our opponent will not see, and you will win the queen. But if they do see it, you steal up a pawn. After this move, after knight takes back in d7, what about, instead of d4, what about d3? How do you take this? g6, you develop the bishop from the fianchetto because that's what happens when your opponent doesn't have these pawns. Let's say the pawn in e3, for example. The center is open, so bishop g7 is the best way. Also because this pawn in c5 cannot be really challenged by a white pawn. That means we are never going to develop the bishop from this diagonal. So let's go queen e2, bishop g7, rook e1, e6. as solid as ever. Knight c3, castle. There is no compensation for that pawn. So if we go back here after bishop to d7, white cannot castle because he loses the pawn. What about a4? The move. I've got it in the notes. That means I must have encountered it at some point and it bothered me. I guess one of the reasons is that, queen b6 is coming, so white just wants to play this move. e6, castle, queen b6, d3. And, yeah, obviously, because white can't really defend the bishop with the knight because you have d4 available. Knight f5. And if c3, then you go with h5. And we're gonna take similar patterns later on. We've seen stuff like this, similar stuff already. If g4 to attack the knight f to e7, it looks like one of those pawn storms that the Grand Prix players typically play. If they play f5, you just take it, right? There's nothing there. They take back, but then you can take back. There's no really an attack. If instead of f5 they play knight to c3, again you play h5, you target that pawn, and g5, and then you can go back in f5. There is no pawn storm coming. Usually the danger is when they play f5 and they take the pawn in e6, take back, and then they play queen f3 with the rook. That's what used to be really annoying to me. But you see, that's how you don't make it happen. Let's go back here after bishop d7 and bishop takes the knight. What about bishop takes knight instead of the rest of it? Okay, bishop takes back, and let's look at this idea. C3. Let's look at this idea. C3. This doesn't actually stop d4 from coming. d4 comes anyway. And after take, you play e6, completely careless, because you want to recapture this bit with the bishop. Why do you want to recapture with the bishop? So the white cannot castle. Okay, take, d4 by white. It looks like our opponent can castle, but now you got this move, intermediate, so that was stupid. Take, and now this move. So that doesn't work. Nothing works. Queen to b7. There's nothing to worry if you ever end up in this position. Check. King moves. Check. Blocks. Castle. No point in playing this game. After the bishop captures in c6, you take back. What about d4? What about this move? Okay, e6. Castle. Knight f5. Finalizing the pressure on this pawn. What about c3? Fine. Take. Bishop to b5. Attacks the rook. Rook e1. And now h5. Do you see how the moves you play are always the same? Knight c3. Queen a5. Looks like we're giving the bishop pair away for nothing. That's crazy. However, we can take back. And now, after a4, queen to a5. What's really going on? Why did we give the bishop pair away? Bishop to d2. Bishop b4. Fine. Rook to c1. These are all the most developing possible moves. You swap everything. And after all the swaps, this pawn is free. And that couldn't really be stopped. It's not like, I don't know, our opponent can take us like this, because then you can take back. We got a lot of attack on this square. And how is our opponent gonna... Okay, let's say queen d3. Computer moves rook to c8. Rook e to c1. Rook e to c1. You play king to d7. And there's absolutely nothing for our opponent. We basically gonna play this game based on this weakness, right? So eventually, if we get the chance to... we're gonna be working on that weakness. It's like... Positions are only slightly better for black. But at least white has something that we can play for, which is this weak pawn. But let's see the last line here. After bishop c6 and castle, we said... if our opponent castle, we play d4. And what to do now? Our opponent can play... Okay, c3, you just play d3. And this bishop is in big trouble. It really cannot develop. And I don't really see any way for our opponent. What about this move attacking the pawn, but the pawn is defended anyway? e6. Our opponent cannot possibly attack this pawn further. Rook f3 will be taken. You see, he can't really go anywhere. So it's a bit stupid. So let's not look at that. So after d4 and d3, e6. What to play? What to do now? Knight to d2. What about c3 now? Is it possible? No, because you take. Strangely enough, although this is now a weak pawn, our opponent can take with the pawn and build some center. Queen to d7, d4. knight to f5, attacking that pawn as much as possible. If they take back, king h1 and then castle, position is much better for black. If instead they play knight a3 developing, take the pawn, take, and now you simply take this, and again, you can see how the bishop abandoning that square, the c1 square allows the fork. So always watch out for that. So after e6 in this position, what about knight to d2? Developing move. Again, knight to f5. Now we're threatening knight e3. Knight to e4. What are we going to do now? Now it's them that are threatening our strong square, although it's very well defended. Bishop and queen, so that's not going to happen. h5. Queen e2, queen e1, b5. b3. How do we make progress in this position? h4. That's why it's always good to push the h pawn. It's a close center, so you gotta push the pawns on the side. Bishop a3. Developing. Knight e3. Rook f2, defending the c2 pawn. h3. What to do now? If our opponent takes the free pawn in c5, you take the knight first. And obviously now there's a bishop under attack, so they have to take our bishop first. But now you can take this one. So they can take the pawn with an attack on the rook. You move the rook. They can do that with an attack on the queen. Queen to d7. And now they can finally recapture that pawn. However, rook to g2, it's a tragedy. King moves. Queen to c6, playing the rook. There's a forced mate in 8 moves. Is there anything else that our opponent could have done? No, there was no other way to take this bishop. So, lost the material no matter what. h3, after h3, we just went through bishop taking the presumably free pawn, which is not free. What about g3, the usual move they play to stop this harassment from this pawn? Okay, take the knight, take back, queen to b6. f5, the usual pawn storm. How are we going to react to that? Knight g4, attack the rook. Rook moves, g6. And the bishop is ready to come into the game. Bishop h6, bishop e3 seems absolute glorious to me. What about taking the pawn, take back, knight to g5, seems like it might stop it, but bishop h6 is coming anyway. Position evaluated -5. What can be done here? Well, nothing. Knight f7, no. Knight f7, you can just give a check first, and then you should also, let's say the king moves, and you can just take the knight. So the bishop b5 variation has been covered. What about, let's make a recap. So f4, d5, e5, knight, knight h6, bishop e2. Let's look at this. Bishop g4 by black. Why? Because since the d2 pawn is still there and the knight cannot defend the other knight, we're going to take advantage of the control we have over d4. So let's say, castle, e6. If they play, for instance, knight c3, knight f5, d3, h5. Usual ideas. Queen e1, the usual idea of the Grand Prix. Queen to b6. h3 attacking the bishop. What to do? We give the bishop back because now we can play check. King moves. Take this pawn. Take back. That pawn is the weakness. The d pawn is the weak one in the Grand Prix. Rook c8, a4. Ready to harass the queen. Bishop e7. Queen f2. Are we happy with the swap? Yes, because after all the swaps, g5. It's a crazy move, really crazy, because, okay, if they don't take, they play g3 to defend that pawn, g4. And we open in the king, the bishop moves, but then h4, ready to take everything, and position evaluated here is -6. If instead after g5, if they take, it looks like the pawn is free, but now knight to e5, and it's an amazing position. We're attacking this pawn, bishop e2 to defend that pawn, but now knight to g4 is such a strong move. You can take back, king moves, and g3, it's a torture. It's an absolute torture. The rook shouldn't really be saved because bishop c5 is forced checkmate in 4 moves. If instead here, when we played e6, if instead of knight c3, what about c3? The annoying move. That it's kind of Alapini move. Well, knight f5 is coming anyway. It looks like the knight doesn't have the same number of squares to go to, but our opponent will not be able to develop the bishop. So what to do now? If knight a3 developing, h5, and now a move like knight to c2 is met with d4, and referred to similar patterns with threatening d3 winning the game. So our opponent has to take back And here our best move is to take back. We're threatening the same thing, d3, but then h4 is coming, and it's a very similar pattern to something seen before. So let's drop the line here. Instead, after h5, if our opponent plays d3 right away, c4 comes. Pawn takes, queen to b6 check, king moves, and now we take this knight. Pawn takes back, and now h4. That's how you play this. We give up this pawn, it doesn't really matter. Well, obviously this cannot really happen. Our opponent has to play knight to g5, to which we will take this bishop, take back, and then queen a6, pinning this pawn, and should it's a much better endgame for black, as you can tell. But here they cannot really take this pawn because of the forced mate, right? It's check, take, you know, they take, and yeah, checkmate. So let's go back a second. So we're looking at the variation, the main line with knight f3, right? We played knight to h6, bishop e2, bishop g4, castle, e6. What about d3? Okay, same stuff, knight f5, c3, h5. So now we are returning to the same pattern. Some of these patterns, when I was explaining them, sometimes I interrupted myself because I knew that a deeper explanation was coming later on. h3 attacking the bishop, take, queen b6. We've seen this stuff before. What to do? I've got a bunch of potential moves here. None of them are good. A move like b3 to see and develop the bishop from that side is not good because g5. This is a move to remember. It's completely free. I mean, if the bishop takes this pawn, which looks free, you win material because knight g3, right? So many traps. If our opponent takes the pawn, knight to e5, and that's something to remember. A move like knight to a bishop f4 developing doesn't work because you can just win this pawn for free. It's a fantastic position. If queen takes c4, takes advantage of the discovered check and wins a lot of material. So after knight takes e5, what about a4, c4 check, d4, take this pawn, completely careless of the piece. Well, I mean, it's pinned yet. So if king to h1, you play b2, it's a fork. You're winning a lot of material. If instead our opponent doesn't move the king, but rather play rook f2 to put more defense over b2, then check, queen takes back, d6. What to do now? If white plays g4, attacking the knight, just to make an example, take, check, rook takes, it's a crazy sacrifice, rook takes, king takes, and now b2. So we are recovering the lost material. The game is close, our opponent has got nothing. If instead here after bishop d6, if instead of that crazy g4 move, what about knight to a3, developing the pieces normally? Rook c8, knight b5, reducing the influence of our queen. What's going on? Bishop g3 attacks the rook. Rook e2 moves away, castle. And the queen cannot really take this pawn because king to g7. And obviously this is really dangerous. If our opponent makes the normal move, let's say bishop to b2, you attack this knight. The knight has to move now. Rook to h8 takes advantage of that queen. The queen has to go. Rook to h4. And the idea is to simply play queen to c7. Position evaluated -4. We're completely inside the opponent territory. They cannot really move anything. Knight b5, knight c4, knight c2. None of these moves is possible. Let's go back. Back in this position after queen to b6. We tried b3 with the fianchetto idea. What about d4 now? Obviously this cannot be played because take. It's free. There's no compensation. What about instead knight to a3? Now g6, knight c2, bishop e7, queen e1, bishop h4 attacking the queen. Queen has to go back, castle. Knight to e3. It looks like our opponent is going to be able to swap with our fantastic knight. Knight to g3. We're not going to allow that. Rook f2, rook h to g8. Ready for the push of the pawns on this side. b4. Our opponent wants to do the same on the other side. We take this pawn, crazy enough. That's not the type of pawn that I would like to play, but the position is evaluated -3 for a reason. When they take back, apparently the best move is knight to e4, and I'm trying to work out how come. Yeah, that's why. That's pretty easy. Coming with an attack here and an attack here, and this king is not going to last that long. So let's go back a second. Instead of knight a3 variation, in this position, when we play queen b6, what about they unpin themselves and also stop knight g2, because they can't really play king h1. What about king h2? g5. You see, if they take, you take back like this. We've seen stuff like that before. What about taking here? In this case, we don't have that trick we did before. Okay, take. Knight to d2, saving the rook. Queen c3. Knight to b3. Bishop to h6. We're happy to swap with this bishop because when now we got the rooks on the open file. Knight to e5 can come anyway. It's crazy because rook's protecting the pawn. Knight e5 comes, but rook c1 should be able to remove our queen from the defense of this knight. But then we just take here. And that's it. If they take, we take back with the knight. We're winning the game. If they take us, queen to g3 is possible. We can recapture the rook. And yeah. So after queen b6, the last line we're going to see is c4. What to do here? Takes c4. Pawn takes back. Bishop e7. Knight c3. It looks like finally our opponent is breathing. It looks like they find the right way to play. Although it's a little bit more passive for white. Knight cd4. Putting the knight in the throne where it belongs. Rook to b1. Queen to b4. This is also a very interesting move. It's attacking this pawn and it's stopping b3 because then you're attacking the knight. It's a wonderful move. Queen d3, developing and protecting the knight. Castle, a3 attacking the queen. What's going on here? Check. Rook takes, pawn takes queen, rook takes rook, take back, pawn takes. Knight has to move. Rook d8. -4 on the engine evaluation. Bishop d2 attacking the pawn. Rook to d3. Don't even care about that pawn because it's protected at the moment. I don't know what can be done here. b3, but now knight to d4. This is such a strong position. -5 on the engine. So let's leave it. So from the start, after f4 and we play d5, e5, knight c6. The main line with knight f3 we play knight h6, bishop h4. What about d3 now? Let's mention this very quickly. Knight to f5 comes, knight c3. e6, and it's basically the same stuff. Castle, h5. Always play such moves against the Grand Prix. h3, queen b6. If we lose the bishop, well, our opponent is in big trouble. You see, if they take this, there's c4 check, and when the king moves, you can take this. So it's a lovely thing to happen. What about, well, okay, c4, d4. What about d4? Take this one with an attack on the knight. Can our opponent save the knight? Knight to h2, and then obviously knight c takes in d4. With all the threats in the wall, we discover threats that win the game. Threatening checkmates. Position evaluated -9, right? So I guess that's enough. If instead the knight goes to a4 here, instead of moving the knight in f3, with a counterattack on our queen, queen to a5, moving the queen away from trouble. Knight to c3, returning. Now you recapture the piece. Take back, and now knight takes back. Position evaluated -5. Right? And here, instead, after d4, obviously we take this pawn. If our opponent plays knight to e1, that's even stupider, I think, because knight d4, bishop to e3 cannot happen because the knight can just take it for free. Rook to f2, stopping the discover check cannot happen because knight to g3, and the checkmate is unstoppable. It's a mate. What else can be done? Okay, let's go back. So after bishop g4, what about our opponent attacks us immediately without the time to play knight f5 and all that? Okay, take, and well, obviously if they take with the g pawn, it's so stupid. e6, and you're threatening queen h4. So after h4, bishop e7. So the check is going to happen no matter what. Our opponent is completely undeveloped on this side. And there's absolutely nothing on this side. So position evaluated -3, even though there's no actual free piece or free pawn or anything like that. It's just the position is horrible. So after bishop f3, e6. What about c3? Well, okay, check. King f1, knight to f5. Threatening this. Yeah, that's just a blunder. Let's leave it. Instead of c3, what about I've got h4 here, or castle. h4, knight f5 is coming anyway. h5, now it's our opponent that is doing that to us, instead of us doing it to them. Fair enough. f6, and now we're going to be taking this pawn. If not, our opponent is going to allow us to develop, and they're in a much worse position. G4, knight G3 attacking the rook. Rook G1, take this pawn. Completely careless of the rook because you can pin it, right? Let's go back a second. So E6, castle, knight F5. What about knight C3? Knight to G3, attack the rook. Rook F2, H5. Knight to E2, challenging our monster knight. Go back, you don't want that. And a move like G4 is met with simply take, and now knight to H4. Much better position for black. If instead of G4 our opponent plays D3, bishop E7, threatening to reach the square H4, which is really good. B3, putting the bishop in fianchetto, queen D7, bishop D2. This is the best moves. Bishop H4 attacking the rook, rook F1, knight E3. The bishop can never go to the fianchetto without being punished real hard. Let's go back a second. Here after knight F5, C3, C3, we haven't seen C3 in this position. C4. So that when the D4 pawn moves, you can just take an en passant and take back H5. And what have I got here? A move like bishop E3 developing is met with G5. It's so common, also because if they do take, then you go knight E5, right? Knight E2, take, and now bishop H6. It's quite a cheeky and humiliating way to lose a piece for white. H5, after H5, instead of bishop E3, what about A4? Thematic move. G5 is happening no matter what. Pawn takes, check. King moves, take this. And this is a much better position. Well, queen E2, for instance, knight to G4, check. Remember this move. You don't want to trade with that bishop. This knights are much better than that bishop. Taking with the pawn is a suicide. Taking with the bishop is met with bishop check. Complete disregard for material. Bishop F4, take this guy. Okay, and we don't care. We don't care. We just don't care when you play against the Grand Prix. Please learn as much as possible from this video, because this opening has to be punished. I've hated it my whole life. It made me stop playing as a Sicilian player. Now I've got so much more stuff, so I'll just see you in the next video.